Supply chain risk management. The world is full of risks, and of course, especially global supply chains needs a really decent risk management. And if you look on the overall risks, and here one example article from McKinsey, they really look on large disruptions of your supply chain. So typically all kind of risks are divided in the magnitude of costs and the ability to anticipate. And we all have seen the pandemic example, which was a very high cost, and you only had 1 month to anticipate. Some of these things are really tricky to manage within the entire supply chain management. There is one golden rule for supporting supply chain risk management from analytics perspective, is that by connecting the entire value chain with seamless flow of data. That means you really have to cross-link in the background as much data as you can do to provide a transparency for the decision making as good as possible. And we have to distinguish a little bit between the inner connectivity, so the supply chain which you can really connect, and the external factors which maybe you have to pull in from external data sources. So let's start from the internal connectivity. This is here, for example, a case example of connecting the different data assets. I've designed a preliminary high-level data model for the entire supply chain. Here in orange you see the inner parts of the supplier elements, and blue here or black as master data management, more closely to the manufacturing parts. When looking on the full model, so here's a full model from the supply chain part in orange, black material masters, which are closely linked to the production part, which is here in blue, and then going to the delivery parts and towards our customer and sales is the green part. This would be the full data model in the background, and this is of course only a starting point, but this shows you already if you really want to drill down kind of tracing risks or across your entire supply chain, data assets should be connected. Otherwise, you will be very isolated in your judgments. So this is just one advice from the inner part, and we will have another section on this entire data model later. And this data model as well is linked to the so-called control tower concept. When looking to the individual risk elements itself in the entire supply chain, you have this kind of inner part. And then, of course, the supplier itself is one big part of the entire risk matrices you have in your company. And especially with the supplier risk analysis, you don't have maybe the data assets than you would have for the inner parts. If we think about the external providers, and if we think about a supplier risk analysis, so we have to enrich our internal data with external data. For the internal data, we have seen before this huge data model, which is more going to what I call the control tower. If you look on the internal data, you have typically also on hand is the customized risk assessment. So every business needs really to tailor the risk on particular materials or on particular suppliers, and you have internal compliance and ethical standards for internal audits and assessments. And these are the typically internal data sets you need to really judge on the supplier risk. And then there are these external factors. These external factors might be something like the credit score of a supplier or third-party certifications. So that's all about the supplier validation. And then there are global regulatory compliance. So in Germany, we have this so-called Lieferkettengesetz, or this is in the European Union, where you really have to trace across your suppliers the compliance and legal parts. And for this, the advice is really to work with external data providers, because you as a company cannot collect all data of all suppliers. And here's only one example of one company, Dun Bradstreet, who's really offering an analytic supplier intelligence, where you really can connect then your internal data against the external data. This is a very classical example where you enrich your entire data sets with external data, which are not directly come from the supplier, but from external vendor. The same possibility you have on the other side towards the customer, if it's going towards market trends. Whenever we go into this entire field of risk classification or supply chain risk assessment, we have to understand where to start at which part. And then finally, you always end up in a kind of segmentation technique where you either segment your suppliers according to special risks, or where you segment your entire supply chain according to risks. And then you're in the huge topic of segmentation, which is the next topic.